Tibbs was frozen with fear. He had only wandered a handful of steps away from the fire to gather more kindling, and yet somehow on this frontier planet, at the edge of fed space, was a scourge. An armoured Goliath built of chitin and rage, his mandibles clacking in ominous malevolence, was standing right before him. Tibbs knew this was the end. So paralysed by terror that he never even registered the voice from behind him call, "Course you can! Plenty of room!" The creature bore down on him, and he knew it was the end. He only had enough time to quickly shut his eyes and offer a small prayer to the gods. Tibbs never felt the scourge eviscerate him, and he was thankful for that. There was no searing pain of being torn limb from limb. Death was rather peaceful, Tibbs thought, though it was entirely too dark. The monotonous hum of insects was a nice touch, and the same smell of burning wood as in life reached into his snout. Something was wrong with this scenario. Tibbs slowly opened his eyes and realized he hadn't been killed at all. There was the same forest he had been looking at, though there was nothing in front of him but endless trees. Had he just imagined the whole thing? Were his nerves just too on edge? A sickening chittering from behind him caught his attention. The damn thing went after the tougher prey first. He knew that a human could hold their own, but against a fully grown scourge? Little Dan needed help. Tibbs spun around, ready to pounce, but what he saw only compounded his confusion. Dan was still there and in one piece, leaning his back against a tree. The scourge was also present, however, but not tearing into the weak, soft flesh of Tibbs' compatriot. It was simply standing near the fire, many of its limbs outstretched towards it, some rubbing together. The scourge made another awful chittering sound, and Dan gave it the oddest reply. "No trouble at all. Mighty nippy out there tonight, and I'd be without manners if I didn't let you come get yourself warm." "Speaking of which," he said, as he held out his arm, "Daniel. Just Dan is fine. Most folk call me Little Dan." The scourge's head cocked to one side as it stared at the offered appendage. "Oh, it's like this," Dan said, as he used his other hand to gently grasp one of its forciples, drawing it to his own and giving a few hearty shakes. "There. Now we're all acquainted." The scourge made another series of horrifying clicks that somehow earned a laugh from Dan. "No, not at all. The opposite, in fact. See, I come from a small place called Lemoyne, and folks there mean well. They do. But they have as many brain cells as there were Dans in town, which was 2. So they all thought it would be a riot to call me Little Dan, and the other Dan, who is yay high," he said, as he drew his arm to about shoulder height, "and 90 pounds soaking Big Dan." Something strange was occurring, and Tibbs needed to get to the bottom of it. "Wait," he called out. "There you are," Little Dan interrupted. "I was getting worried. Figured you wandered off and went and got yourself lost." "What?" Tibbs shook his head. "No, that's not important right now. You can understand that thing?" Dan looked up and almost offended. "Course I can. Speaking common, ain't it?" Tibbs looked to the scourge, confused. "No?" Little Dan just laughed at this. "Yeah, is. You just ain't got an ear for accents. Now come get yourself by the fire. You'll catch your death out here." Tibbs hesitated for a moment. He certainly didn't want to be disemboweled, but he also didn't feel too particular about dying of exposure. So with carefully measured steps, he made his way back to the fire, ensuring to keep the small wall of flame between him and the world-ender. More mandible chatter sent another chill down his spine. How Dan could pretend to comprehend what he was saying was still beyond him. "Don't be rude. It's asking your name." Dan's voice broke through his thoughts. "Oh, Tibbs. My name is Tibbs," he mumbled. The scourge then made a series of ill-sounding clacks, and Dan grinned at that. "Yeah, I don't think either of us are going to be able to say that. I'll call you Clicky. That fine?" This earned a strange wheezing sound from the scourge, and a hearty laugh from Dan. Even Tibbs couldn't help himself and chuckled a little. The bizarrity of the situation had broken through horror. Here was a blight on the galaxy within mere paw lengths of himself, and he was having what amounted to a pleasant conversation with the thing. "So," Dan began, "this planet's a mite off the beaten path, so I gotta ask. We're out doing science. How the hell did you end up here?" The Scourge began to tell how it arrived at this backwater ball, and as it spoke, Tibbs strained himself to listen. Slowly but surely, words began to form. Heavily accented, some hardly coherent, but they were there. Words in base common, words he could understand. Tibbs suddenly felt a pang of guilt. He suddenly knew why no one could translate. There was nothing to translate. He had seen the videos, the wailing and the gnashing of maws, but now he spared a thought. Had they been the ravenous chittering of a hive-minded horde? Were they war calls of their rage-tranced warriors? Or had they been something else? Pleas for mercy, or petitions for peace? "Wait." Tibbs stopped Clicky's account. "I can hear it now. Can you start again?" He was determined to get the full story, straight from the mouth of a monster, if he could. Although Dan still had to help with some of the more challenging words, Tibbs was able to follow along with what amounted to be a great tale of woe. It recounted how it had been a humble gardener on one of their great familial ships, how a Federation destroyer caught them out in the black and tore into its hull, how all of its clutchmates were kissed by the void, and only by the grace of the many-legged goddess did it manage to find an escape pod in time, how it should be in mourning for siblings long lost, but had been pressed into survival by the cruelness of it all. The Scourge then broke down into a series of noises that Tibbs could only surmise to be the uncontrolled sobs of a deeply broken soul. And Tibbs felt genuinely terrible. Here was a being, hurt and alone in a universe that hated it, seemingly for the crime of simply existing. Dan's arm reached out, and he soothingly began to rub Clicky's back. "All right. You're all right. We got you now." Well, maybe not the whole universe. The saga of sadness that came from the creature, the sympathy offered by little Dan, struck a chord with poor Tibbs, and he realized that in this very moment he needed to be better. So fighting his fear, he made his way round the fire and positioned himself right next to the Scourge. He reached his own arm out to bring comfort to Clicky and cast his gaze skywards. As he stared at the stars, he knew that, after tonight, the galaxy would never be the same.